Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this really exciting program where we will be talking about Roe v. Wade and Jewish faith, Jewish action. We are thrilled that you're here. I see that more people are signing in by the minute, so I'm going to go over our plan for the evening and give a few brief announcements, and I'll talk very, very slowly for this part as people continue to file in, but we want to make sure and use our hour as best we can because there is lots to cover. So we are thrilled that you are here, thrilled that you're joining us. If you are Congregation Emmanuel members or if you are NCJW Houston folks, if this is your first time at Emmanuel, virtually welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. I want to point out that we are in webinar mode this evening. If you've been on a lot of Zooms, you may or may not have been on a lot of webinars. This means that you, the participants, are not on camera, so you don't have to worry about that. It may be a relief. And you're not visible to other participants. If you have questions this evening, we are going to use the Q&A feature. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button with sort of two chat boxes that says Q&A, and you should be able to type a question in there that I'm going to serve as the moderator this evening. I'll be able to see. So if you've got a question for any of our speakers, feel free to pop those into the Q&A feature as the best means to get them to us. And I want to give just a little overview of our schedule this evening. In just a moment, we're going to receive a welcome from the National Council of Jewish Women and their Houston chapter. And then we're going to have, I'll do a little bit of framing, and then Rabbi Silk will give us an introduction to Jewish views on abortion and reproductive choice. And then we'll welcome in Sheila Katz, and she will share with us about NCJW's work nationally, and she and I will engage in a conversation. We may have a few other special guests during that time, and this will include time for all of our speakers to answer any of the questions that you put in that Q&A function. So we're really thrilled that you all are here, and we're going to jump right in. So it is now my honor to invite some words of welcome on behalf of the National Council of Jewish Women and NCJW's Houston chapter. I am pleased to introduce NCJW board member Eliza Plotkin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Fixler. It's an honor to welcome you here tonight on behalf of NCJW Greater Houston Section. My name is Eliza Plotkin, and I am the immediate past president of the Greater Houston Section and a current national board member of NCJW, Inc. Especially want to thank Rabbi Fixler and the entire clergy team at Congregation Emmanuel for putting together this program tonight and for inviting our incredible CEO, Sheila Katz, to talk about the work we're doing on the ground with NCJW. If you want to find out more information about NCJW and the Greater Houston Section and the work we're doing, you can log on to ncjw.org and join at our advocate level, which is totally free, and that will loop you into information. So thank you again for joining us tonight. It's such a privilege to have you all here.
Thank you, Eliza. We are thrilled to have you and NCJW as our local partners. I'm going to say one more time, because I know some people have signed in since I started talking, and I know I'm repeating myself. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature, which you should see a button for at the bottom of your screen. That's the best way to get questions to me, which I will share with our speakers as appropriate. I want to begin my part of the introduction with a few words of welcome. We are honored to have tuning in tonight two of the elected officials for the district where Emmanuel is located. We are thrilled to welcome our new state representative, Ann Johnson, and also our city council person, Abby Kamen, who are joining us this evening. I also want to welcome Reverend Erica Forbes, outreach and faith coordinator from Texas Freedom Network, who you'll get to hear from a little bit later, and who's an important advocate for reproductive justice in Houston and throughout the state. I also want to start with a tiny, not a tiny, but an important disclaimer. There may be times this evening when we default to using terms like women and mother, but I want to name from the outset that we also know that people of various gender expressions and identities can get pregnant and need access to a range of reproductive health services. We hope if and when we use these terms that you will hear them broadly. Yesterday on Shabbat, we read from the first chapters of the book of Exodus. The story of the new Pharaoh who arose over Egypt is a tale of a totalitarian regime. And the major way that the Pharaoh is shown to subjugate the Israelites is by exerting control over their reproductive choices. The biblical author paints a bleak world for the oppressed minority Israelite community by showing us the limited options they had specifically around family choice. And who are the heroes of the first chapters of Exodus? The midwives and mothers, the sisters and allies who show up for the radical and sacred act of pregnancy and birth. The midwives, Shifra and Puah, who put themselves between the Israelite women and the government that wished to regulate their pregnancies. Batya, the Pharaoh's daughter who defies her father's law to stand with the Israelites in support of their choices. Miriam, Moses' sister, who the Midrash says was a prophet even at a young age, and when her people saw darkness, she foretold the birth of new possibilities. And Yocheved, Moses' mother, for whom bringing a child into the world was an act of spiritual resistance, a defiant decision to hope. But I dream of a world where no pregnancy needs to be an act of resistance. I dream of a world where we celebrate and sanctify a full range of reproductive choices and where we ensure that everyone has equal access to those choices. If a lack of reproductive freedom is Egypt, then this is the promised land. And I imagine that you are here because you share that dream, or at least you want to understand it better. And how do we get from here to there? It's a long and difficult road that requires leadership and vision. And you are going to hear tonight from leaders like Sheila Katz, who is a modern Moses leading the way towards that promised land. But the story does not start with Moses. It starts with the midwives and mothers, sisters, and allies, Israelites and Egyptians acting together to change an unjust system and ensure reproductive freedom for all. Together they worked across lines of difference and nationality and class to birth a brighter future. We can be the midwives and mothers, sisters, and allies who work shoulder to shoulder towards a vision of reproductive justice. 48 years ago, the historic Roe v. Wade decision offered a conception of a new future for freedom, and it is my hope that maybe we are nearing a time when that new hope will be born. It will emerge because it has been and will be nurtured by all of us midwives and mothers, sisters, and allies. I know that this Zoom is full of reproductive stories, and that tonight's conversation will bring back memories that are happy and memories that are sad, memories of pregnancies that were joyful or painful, that ended blissfully or abruptly by choice or by fate, memories of birth and miscarriage, abortion and infertility. As we begin this conversation tonight, I want to hold space for that tapestry of Torah that is the stories gathered in our virtual community this evening, to celebrate the ways that all of those stories help shape us into the people and the activists we are and will become. And I want to remind you that if this evening's conversation brings up for you any painful or joyful memories that you wish to share, our clergy are here for you. And speaking of our clergy, I want to hand things over now to Rabbi Pamela Silk, Associate Rabbi here at Congregation Emanu, to lead us in an exploration of traditional Jewish approaches to the questions of abortion and choice.
Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be part of this important program and thrilled that so many of you have chosen to join us. We have just a little bit of time to go through some of the Jewish sources, but my goal is to present to you what the Torah, rabbinic tradition, and modern commentaries say about life and the ending of the fetus's life before a baby is born. So without further ado, we'll begin with the book of Exodus. In Exodus 21, I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along with some of our texts tonight. Let me do that. In Exodus 21, we are taught that he who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. Shortly after, in that same chapter, we read specifically of a case when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined according as a woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. In this important text, this illustration of something that must have happened in the history of our people, something our text brings to life as a question that people wondered: how do we exact damages when a pregnant woman is struck and the life of her unborn child terminates? What is the damage? Is it the same as one who fatally strikes a person? We know it is not, because the offender is not put to death, but rather exacted damages by the woman's husband. Mishnah Torah then teaches us one who strikes a woman and causes her to miscarry, even though this wasn't his intent, he must pay the value of the fetus to the woman's husband and damage and pain to the woman. We learn from these important texts, from the Torah and then from the Mishnah Torah, that a fetus certainly does have value, but it is not considered a life, not the same life as a person. We then continue and we look at rabbinic tradition in the Mishnah that teaches us if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. The value of the mother's life takes precedent over the fetus. And if the fetus threatens the mother's life, it can be destroyed to preserve her life. Only after the fetus has emerged and it is in itself a life are they considered equal. But our tradition here is clear that it is the mother's life that takes precedent, and that's how decisions are made. We then continue, we look back in the book of Genesis, where we are reminded during the act of creation that the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. It is that breath of life that animated and created life in man. Rashi, in his commentary on the Talmud, comments on the text that we had read before this, when it talks about if its head came out of the mother, with a woman that is experiencing difficulty giving birth and is in mortal danger. The midwife extends her hands and cuts it up and exacts the pieces. As the entire time that it has not gone out into the air of the world, it is not considered a soul. And so it is possible to kill it and to save its mother. But when its head came out, we cannot touch it to kill it, as it is likely a born baby. We do not push off one soul for another. And the Mechilta de Rabbanan Yishmael, if a person strikes any nefesh of a person and he dies, he shall be put to death. Leviticus 24, verse 17. I might think that this would mean an 8-month birth, right? A baby born before its full term, and perhaps a baby that is destined to die would also be included in this. It is therefore written, if one strikes a man, whereby we are appraised, that he is not liable unless he kills one who is destined to live. You see, once a baby's head emerges from its mother's body and it is viable, it is considered a nefesh, a soul, and cannot be destroyed. According to Jewish tradition, life begins at birth. Similarly, just like the life that God breathed into the first person, that breath brings life. Up until the point, the fetus is a potential life, certainly that has value, but is not a nefesh. And so recognizing what is the status of a fetus, and then that the mother's life takes precedence over the fetus, and finally that life begins with birth, it is important to look at commentaries and responsa, letters and questions that were asked to the rabbis over time as people, just like you and I, dealt with these questions in their real life and wanted guidance from their tradition. We look at Rabbi Joseph M. Den Responsa, Sheila Katz, and it is from the 18th century. The questioner asks about an adulterous married woman who is pregnant. And it's a good question. It appears to me to permit her to abort. And even in the case of a legitimate fetus, there is reason to be lenient if there is great need. As long as the fetus has not begun to emerge, even if the mother's life is not in jeopardy, but only so as to save her from evil associated with it, that would cause her great pain. So even in the case of the adulterous woman who's pregnant, and it says, even if the fetus seems to be just fine, there is leniency in the ruling to allow her to abort, even when her life is not being pursued, so as to spare her pain. Similarly, in the 20th century, Rabbi Mordechai Winkler writes that mental health risk has been definitely equated with physical health risk. This woman, in danger of losing her mental health unless the pregnancy is interrupted, would therefore accordingly qualify. We can imagine this rabbi getting a question, being asked, even though the woman's physical life is not in danger, the mental distress that this pregnancy must have been causing, would it be permitted for her to abort? And the answer is yes. In the mid-1900s, Rabbi Ben Zion Chai Uziel wrote that it is clear that abortion is not permitted without reason. That would be destructive and frustrative to the possibility of life. But for a reason, even if it's a slim reason, such as to prevent disgrace, then we have precedent and authority to permit it. Precedent and authority. Our tradition is steeped in the words of our ancestors, of our teachers, of the leaders of our community from generation to generation, going all the way back to the texts in Exodus, to our rabbinic resources that help individuals ask and answer real questions in their life. And that while this is a heavy matter, a matter that nobody enters into lightly, a matter that takes our whole heart and great thoughtfulness, it is recognized that there is precedent and authority to prevent somebody from feeling disgraced by a pregnancy that is not healthy for them or unwanted. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg writes, if there is a danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation. Also, if her health is poor and to cure her or to relieve her from great pain, it is necessary to abort the fetus, even if she's not in actual danger, there's room to permit it, based on halachic authorities' evaluation of the situation. The reason I think this last part is important is because our tradition strives to look at legal status and to look at legal rulings and to find within text precedent to help answer these important questions. In our final text of the evening, Rabbi Cass Abelsid writes, there is clear precedent in the tradition to permit abortion of a fetus to save the mother's life, to safeguard her health, or even for a very thin reason, such as to spare her physical pain or mental anguish. Physical pain and mental anguish, even if somebody's life is not endangered, are reasons to permit abortion. Ultimately, abortion is permitted to save the mother's life and spare her from pain and suffering, and not simply in times when her life is in danger. Even strict Jewish authorities who argue against abortion permit it under such circumstances. Rabbi, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Thank you, Rabbi Silk, for that really helpful introduction. We gave you a very short time to cover a very long period of Jewish textual history, and thank you for that. And I see a couple of questions coming in, which we really appreciate, and we will try and find time towards the end to respond to them. If you have questions, one more time, just a reminder to use the Q&A feature, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. But what I want to do now is I want to bring in our main speaker for tonight. Sheila Katz is the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women, NCJW, as you will hear us refer to it throughout the evening, a network of over 180,000 grassroots activists and supporters across the U.S. who are living out their Jewish values and turning their progressive ideals into action. NCJW has been a leading voice for justice in the United States since 1893, when a Chicago-based social reformer, Hannah Solomon, was asked to chair the Jewish Women's Committee of the Chicago's World's Fair. When Solomon and her recruits discovered that their participation would consist of pouring coffee and other hostess duties, they walked out. Soon after, they founded the National Council of Jewish Women, changing forever the role of Jewish women and the nature of volunteerism. As CEO, Sheila has built on NCJW's storied history of advocacy. She has overseen the founding of a Rabbis for Repro campaign, through which over 850 Jewish clergy members have pledged to teach about reproductive health, rights, and justice, and create an open system of support for reproductive health care access in their communities. Additionally, under Sheila's leadership, NCJW has made advancing anti-racism efforts at the national and local levels a priority, showing the intersectionality of racial justice in all of the organization's main advocacy issues, including reproductive health, rights and justice, immigration, and voter engagement. Sheila previously served as Hillel International's Vice President for Student Engagement and Leadership. During her 12 years at Hillel, she engaged Jewish students and professionals worldwide through programs such as Ask Big Questions, which she co-founded and directed to guide students through conversations that help them to understand themselves and others, and Mitzvot, Hillel's nonpartisan civic engagement campaign that helped 19,000 students register to vote or request absentee ballots leading up to the 2018 midterms. In 2014, Sheila was appointed to the White House Committee advising President Obama on higher education and women's rights. She is a longtime advocate for equal pay and mentors young women on the issue. In addition, she is a strong voice for survivors of sexual assault and an activist fighting for inclusion of people with disabilities. Sheila also serves on the executive committee of a national coalition of over 100 Jewish organizations working to promote safety, respect, and equity in Jewish communal spaces. She holds an MS in teaching from Pace University and a BA in politics from Ithaca College. She is a proud alumna of the Wexner Foundation Field Fellowship and Teach for America. Sheila was named one of 2019's 50 most influential Jews in the United States by Forward and one of 2020 Faith Leaders to Watch by the Center for American Progress. And I can tell you about Sheila, the important fact that you should know about Sheila. Sheila is, when I was in the Wexner Foundation, she was assigned to be my buddy. I was a year ahead of her. And it was a buddyship that was official, but turned into a real friendship. But more importantly, Sheila is a twin, and she has promised to mentor my twins on how to grow up to be amazing advocates for social justice and awesome women. So I'm grateful to her for that. And so welcome to Sheila.
Thank you so much for having me here. And it's so amazing because obviously I love the whole staff of your synagogue and also NCJW Houston. So it feels like this was meant to be to come together. I wish I could be there in person and can't wait post-COVID to see you all then. But thank you so much for having me today.
It is one of the benefits of the Zoom time is that we get to have conversations with folks who it would be much more of a production to get you here. So we're glad that you can join us from your home. So we're going to, Sheila and I are going to engage in a conversation. Some of our other speakers and presenters will have thoughts and want to jump in. We had a prep call for this a couple weeks ago where we just got in like a really good dialogue, and hopefully that it will be that all over again. But I want to start with what I think is the question on a lot of people's minds as they're tuning in this evening, which is with the recent addition of Amy Coney Barrett to the U.S. Supreme Court, the balance of political power has shifted, and we can expect to see more challenges to Roe v. Wade in the years to come. In your national work and advocacy, what are you hearing about what's happening in the court, and what work is NCJW leading to protect the right to access reproductive health care?
Yep, it's a big question. It's not so great, my answer, but there is a lot for us to do. First, I'll start with the good stuff is that we expect some of the needed change to happen with this new administration and Congress. It's not going to be super easy, so we've got work to do. But in the Supreme Court arena, the most prominent case that that they're looking at is something called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is a challenge to Mississippi's unconstitutional 15-week ban that also threatens abortion providers with criminal charges. So the background here is that a federal court struck this down already as unconstitutional. The state appealed it, and now it's going to the Supreme Court asking them to specifically dismantle Roe. And so for the past several months, this case has been there, and the Supreme Court has scheduled and then postponed multiple times a conference to decide whether they're going to hear this case. If the Supreme Court should hear this case, which we could learn about as early as tomorrow, and eventually uphold the ban, it would definitely strike at the very heart of Roe v. Wade. And while it is a Mississippi law, the impact of this ruling would reverberate around the country. Texas is not one of the states that would immediately need to shut down abortion practices. You would need your attorney general with legislators to decide on that according to the way your law is set up, which in this moment does not look so good. And so there's about 20 states poised to immediately seek a ban on abortion. And without Roe, at some point, an anti-abortion Congress and president could pass a national federal ban on abortion. There are other paths to like these bad things that could happen, not just this way. The Supreme Court doesn't actually have to overrule Roe to ban abortion access, essentially. They could kind of chip away at some of the protections under Roe, which is what we've seen the strategy so far be, because it's been difficult to find the right case. Those who are against abortion feel they have the right case in the Dobbs case. So we're watching it very, very, very closely. And if they don't get that case, there's over a dozen additional cases right now on abortion access that are in the circuit courts, just one step away from the Supreme Court. So the hard news I have today is that we believe at some point in the near future, potentially in the next few months to the next year, one of these cases will make its way up to the Supreme Court. And based off of the makeup of the judges there, we can't come up with any scenario of this leading the way that we would hope it would lead. That said, that's bad. We're going to fight against it. We're going to do everything we can. We can share examples. There are some legislation, there's some action that people can take that would protect people. And I know you have, at least NCJW Houston has state policy advocates, I think Bobby Cohen and Elise Rosenberg and Karen Edelstein, and all three are great people to stay connected to. There's two pieces of legislation, the Women's Health Protection Act, which would really guarantee providers the right to freely deliver on care the way they see fit. Right? Imagine that, doctors being able to be doctors. That's very important. And then there's the Each Women Act, which is also super important because it repeals something called the Hyde Amendment, which you may have heard about, definitely came up in presidential in the election recently. And what I could say about the Hyde Amendment is if you care about racial justice, which y'all should, then you should care about repealing the Hyde Amendment because it's racist, like point blank racist. And basically it denies abortion coverage to people who have Medicaid, Medicare, and the Children's Health Insurance Program, which some people know as CHIP. It extends to federal employees and dependents, military personnel and dependents, Peace Corps volunteers, Native Americans receiving care, et cetera, federal prisons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people, and it needs to go. People should be able to access abortion regardless of their income and regardless of their backgrounds. So those are two things poised to be able to make an impact this year that I would say, for those of you on this call who really deeply care about abortion access, these are two pieces of legislation you can get involved with right now. And I do know there is a Texas, I think like a virtual digital lobby day that at least NCJW Houston and others are participating in that will focus on those two pieces. So that's the good and the bad of it, Josh. It's a scary time, and I would just say I'm excited to know that there are people of all genders on this call. This isn't only a women's issue, as you said in the beginning. Trans men can become pregnant, other people can become pregnant, but also this is a direct attack for the majority women's bodies and trans men bodies, and particularly Black and Brown bodies. And it deserves to have the kind of outrage that so many other things do. And it shouldn't just be the people disproportionately impacted by it who are fighting for their rights.
So I wanted to ask you to go a little further on sort of what you're imagining NCJW's role is. I know it's really hard to know sort of like what that national advocacy is going to look like, because we're looking at sort of a new Congress, a new president, also this new Supreme Court that hasn't sort of shown itself yet. But as you're, I see you on Twitter all the time sort of rolling up your sleeves for whatever that fight looks like. And I'm just curious how you're thinking about like, what does that mean for you and your work and for NCJW more broadly?
Yeah, and now that we know the makeup of Congress, it's certainly going to be helpful in us thinking through what the strategy is going to be. So what I could say is 100% National Council of Jewish Women is all in figuring out how to protect abortion access. And, the hard part of this is we've shifted our strategy from merely protecting to really imagining a post-Roe scenario. And we have to do that in order to make sure we're doing everything possible that we can to protect every single person in this country from being able to have this particular kind of access. So first and foremost, which you are a part of, it was very intentional that we launched Rabbis for Repro, which now is over 1,000 rabbis in every state in this country. And we did it because for whatever reason, when people think about abortion and they think about religion, they think they don't go together. And it's just simply not true. It's a narrative that should be dismantled. And it's a narrative that we need to say loudly. And so Jews in particular have a very important role to play. It's not just, it certainly is the human dignity of things. It's not just that fetuses, as a lot of these laws should have these protections. We wouldn't agree with that. We should say human women and human trans men and human pregnant people should have protections according to our tradition, according to just basic human dignity. And so we wanted rabbis to begin speaking out about this, or for those who've been involved in a long time to continue speaking out about this. A long time ago, I think, particularly around Roe, it just became assumed that this was the law of the land and there wasn't more work to do. But there's over 450 restrictions right now in this country and 25 abortion bans over the last 2 years. And I'm sure we'll talk about COVID, but like in so many states, when COVID hit, abortion was deemed non-essential. And this is essential medical procedure that's also time sensitive. So to ban abortions in the middle of a global pandemic is just unfathomable. So our commitment is to continue to work with the Jewish community, to be loud, to be vocal, to counter the narratives, because that's actually very important. It impacts Supreme Court decisions, it impacts court decisions, and the faith voice is very, very critical in actually swaying public opinion and narrative. We want the word abortion to be normative. We want the 1 in 4 people under 45 years old who can get pregnant, who have had an abortion, to feel totally welcome and included in the communities that they're in, no matter why or how they had an abortion. The path that we're exploring right now that I can't go too far into because we're still doing a lot of the research, we're going to be looking at medication abortion as a potential angle around what it would look like if abortion clinics close. Most abortion clinics use medication abortion. The majority of abortions today are used through pills. There's really no reason people just can't get them in their own homes and have a forced miscarriage themselves. So those are some of the things we're looking at. And then each Woman Act, WIPA, and the kind of activism on the ground is going to be really, really critical, certainly in the next few months, but definitively in this next year. And we'll be working very closely with the Biden administration around what kind of actions Biden himself can be taking, and Congress can be taking, and the White House can be taking. So it's not hopeless, but we are responding to what it means that the Supreme Court is without Justice Ginsburg, we don't have our person there holding this to ensure that it's not going to go the way that we had all hoped it would. So we really do have to prepare for a different kind of an outcome there.
Thank you. And those reasons that you gave is why like all 4 of Emmanuel's clergy were signed on to Rabbis and Clergy for Repro within the first, I think, 24 hours. Maybe because we got some text messages from people saying we needed to do that, but because that is a commitment. And what I have found in my experience is like people do associate faith and abortion. They just think that all faith are anti-abortion. And
yeah, and most faiths aren't. Even, I mean, people don't know Catholics for Choice. I also recommend following them and amplifying their voice. The majority of faiths are supportive of abortion. Some of them have conditions here or there, but at the end of the day, when you think about this in practice, when you think about what it means to value vulnerable people, when you think about what it means to value human people, period, you would value the rights and the decisions for people to make their medical decisions for themselves. So it's not only the Jewish faith. But I will say, I mean, we went into a little bit with Rabbi Silk, one of the most annoying things, I'm just going to name it that way, about some of the arguments against abortion in a faith space is they're literally taking our text and misinterpreting it. Like, this is our text that they are looking at, and they are looking at the words incorrectly. So we actually have a huge role to play in correcting the myths and the misinformation around what text says about abortion in general. So I'm so glad, I mean, and you've been doing it, you've been outspoken about this for so long, which we're so grateful for. And we're hoping that everybody will follow the trends that you're setting and actually talk about this as if it's normal, because it is.
And part of our lives as human beings, and like what I love about being a rabbi is that Judaism is about our lives as human beings, and all of them, not some parts of our lives. Like, Judaism isn't this thing that exists when we're at synagogue, but when we're in our doctor's office, we're not Jewish. And so and our ability to empower people to see the decision to have an abortion as a Jewish decision, part of all of the difficult and complex decisions they make in their lives, that God blesses and is there with them in the joy and the pain of that, is I think part of what we're trying to do. And there's this advocacy level that you're talking about, and then this sort of culture change level that is even broader, that is about how do we make a world where the sort of abortion is destigmatized, where people can talk about their abortions in the same way that they can talk about other medical procedures that they can choose to talk about or choose not to talk about. But there are not a lot of other medical procedures that people are shamed into having. There aren't a lot of medical procedures where there are people standing on the street with picket signs that you have to walk past to go to see your urologist or whatever that is. And that that's part of that larger culture change question. You mentioned COVID, and I want to get there because I think that that's also a super important and present for people piece of this, which is that I like to say that a natural disaster of any kind doesn't create problems, it just exacerbates them. But I think we have seen sort of new frontiers of the conversation about reproductive justice emerge, or at least become present for people because of COVID-19 and sort of its impact, its disproportionate impacts, et cetera. So I'd love to hear you talk about what you guys are seeing with how that has played out.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right. The issues that are there before are there, but exacerbated. What I'd say just about women generally in COVID, is that women are disproportionately impacted, as we know, and they're being left behind, they're being left out, in some cases actively attacked. So women have been on the front lines in response to COVID. 9 out of 10 healthcare workers are women. The majority of essential workers are women. The majority of people losing their jobs are women. Just this past month in December, 140,000 jobs lost in this country. All 140,000 of them were women. And wait for it, all 140,000 of them were Black and brown women. And so all of these things are connected, and it's happening at the same time where people aren't investing in childcare, which I would like to say is change these days. And there's people of all genders at the center of what childcare looks like in their home, but we know that's not the case. And when you open back a country and you don't fix childcare, it's women who are left behind. And there were some benefits recently in the COVID legislation, but it was like a tenth of basically what we asked for. So just imagine redoing your roof and only doing that amount. It might seem like a lot of money, but it doesn't get you very far if it rains, right? So we've got a lot to do just to protect women overall from the pandemic and from the impact. The decisions we make about childcare, the decisions we make about jobs and how we're helping people right now will impact women in the workplace for decades and decades and decades. And so it's very important we're focused on that. And then I would also say what was so disheartening, maybe not surprising, but still in these moments, it's still surprising to see the things that people would choose to do. To have during COVID abortion be classified as non-essential in so many states, including in Texas, was just horrific. right? People time sensitive, it gets more dangerous as in certain ways for women if they wait. There's all sorts of reasons people have abortions. I don't like to always cling to what could be these like worst case doom and gloom scenarios. Plenty of people have abortions because they simply want to have an abortion. But at a moment where domestic violence was at the highest point it has ever been in our country, to potentially deny people the ability to get an abortion really impacts their well-being. And in so many states, having 24-hour laws to try to go and then to wait, also in the age of COVID, is challenging. And what I would point people to, I believe it was in Texas, there was this New York Times op-ed that came out in the middle, early on in COVID, about a woman trying to get an abortion who ended up needing to drive over 800 miles. And on the way, finding out abortion clinics were closing, but then open, and then the state was challenging. That doesn't give people dignity, doesn't help them with what they need. To have to take off your work, to have to, all these loopholes and all these like obstacles to put people through to simply have a procedure that's going to be best for them. It's devastating. And so I think it showed us really clearly what particular legislators were trying to do. There was no real reason to have this on a banned list as far as essential procedures, but it was. And in the first COVID relief package, the only nonprofits unable to access those PPP loans that the Jewish community, by the way, celebrated because so many of us had access to it were abortion clinics. And the Hyde Amendment passed as part of that COVID relief package. And so we have to be paying attention to this to make sure that in our advocacy about things that don't seem to be about abortion as well, that we are paying attention to how people are placing these things in places they don't belong. So it's definitely not been the easiest for people seeking abortions in the last 9-10 months or so. Really hard to watch. And I'm also really proud of the work so many local folks are doing to advocate for better laws in their states and to classify this as essential. And the last thing I'll just say, because I could talk a lot about these things, just a quick story. I was at the Supreme Court doing a press conference around Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, Justice Amy Coney Barrett now, and I needed to take my mask off in order to speak where I was speaking. And there were all of these people protesting around us. It was a group of people of faith. And we said to everyone, we're like, you go do your protest. We're not here to disagree. We just got to get on the microphone and do this thing with the press. And we ended up getting surrounded by people who were there to support Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And all were not wearing masks. And so I ended up going up to this group of teenagers who were the closest ones to me. And I said, hi. Like, I'm Sheila, I need to speak and I have to take off my mask to do it. I have asthma. I'm very scared about getting COVID. Would you do me a favor and put your mask on or just stand 2 feet further away? And these are teenage girls I'm talking to who are there from their own sense of faith and whatever they were doing. And I saw them, they really wanted to do it, Josh. They had the masks. I saw they were like, and they didn't. And they literally said to me, well, it's my body, my choice. And I was just like, well, that's a message I agree with. But in this case, your choices are impacting my body. And, thankfully I had some other people there kind of get in the way a bit to allow me to get to the microphone and take my mask off for a moment to speak. But it's been really interesting right now, people going to abortion clinics, not only are they faced with the normal people who are there yelling at them as they go in, which is humiliating and horrific, but they're being yelled at by people who aren't wearing masks, and it's putting them at extra risk. So if there's ever a moment to have some laws and regulations around this, it should be that abortion clinics are open and no one's allowed to stand out there, or at least has to stand a certain distance away if they're going to choose to be there without masks.
That all of those stories are heartbreaking and complicated, and I want to drill down a little bit to Texas, because as we said earlier, sort of so goes Texas, so goes the rest of the country in a certain way, and here I want to invite Reverend Erica Forbes, who is the Outreach and Faith Coordinator for Texas Freedom Network, who is doing this work on the ground all over the state, and we are really lucky also to have as a partner. And so I'll have you go first, and then Sheila, if you've got other pieces to jump in with. But we know that Texas matters. We know from the whole women's health decision at the Supreme Court level that people are watching Texas. that there are folks in Texas who really want to drive things to the Supreme Court, these test cases. And so I want to know, Reverend Erica, what are you seeing on the ground, and what are you bracing yourself for in this legislative session, and how can we be a support to you? And you're muted.
My favorite two words in the new language.
It's required one time per Zoom meeting that someone has to say that, so thank you.
I will say that, notwithstanding the events of last week, quite frankly, people on the ground in Texas were tired. And believe it or not, they were tired not from the fight around reproductive justice, but tired from the weight of carrying the emotional drama that unfolds in Texas. And so we saw a lot of just fatigue in terms of fighting in ways we didn't imagine, in a time and age when we didn't imagine we'd have to be fighting using social media, or we'd have to be fighting the causes around reproductive freedom in a way that is unlike galvanizing at the Capitol. So when things started going badly, when the first quarantine in March happened, and we started seeing Texas clinics, well, we heard from our governor that abortion was no longer an essential service, there was a collective gasp. But what happened, interesting enough, among people of faith and among organizers, was a double down on our efforts to fight, which is, to me, nothing short, of course, I'm going to attribute it to that which is greater, call it God, spirit, whatever name you call it, that nefesh, that breath of life, actually breathing itself into the work that we do. So while we were fatigued, the way in which the on the ground organizers were treated, and on the ground things that were happening so quickly once COVID-19 quarantine hit, it actually galvanized us. And so even though with our new Supreme Court justice being placed on the Supreme Court, even though that was a devastating blow, in addition to a host of other devastating blows, there's actually a new energy happening, because I don't know if this makes any sense to the listeners, but the minute things get to a point of ridiculousness, there's something that actually creates this level of resilience, the likes of which we can't quite explain, except to describe it as there's something greater moving through us. So that's what we're seeing on the ground, in addition to having to scramble to what's it going to look like with the ledge session? Are we testifying online? Are we, how are we organizing in a way that we didn't imagine? And so right now we're seeing huge amounts of energy, where Texas Freedom Network has experienced a surge in interest, both financially and just from people volunteering, that we couldn't imagine. So believe it or not, this crisis has made us double down on our efforts here on the ground. So it's almost like this idea that the resilience isn't optional anymore. So I kind of want to put that in context. I think that's what I would want to share.
I want bumper stickers that say resilience isn't optional. I also want to thank you, Reverend Erica, for showing up with the Hebrew. I enjoyed that. And to we saw that too with our Emanu did a civic engagement campaign. We had over 100 people involved in helping with that. We reached we believe 100% of our congregants with that campaign, and we saw this fire from people that was sort of like, because of the compressed space of the injustice we're seeing in the world, and the pandemic, and the being stuck at home, all of that sort of was this pressure cooker that bursts out with this energy that is exciting and is inspiring, and I think, and then the challenge is, how do we find avenues for that energy in a world where we can't go to the steps of the Capitol and shout and do the state Capitol to do our advocacy in the ways that we have in the past, and that's going to look different. And because our statewide leaders are I think working really hard Some of them are working really hard to make sure that there's access for people during this time to be able to participate. And some of them are working really hard to use COVID as an excuse to not to be less accessible than usual. So that is a really challenging piece to navigate.
Thanks for letting me share it. Thanks, you guys.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for being here.
It's a good mention too, that as people are thinking about getting involved, local is where it's at. So the Texas Freedom Network, along with NCJW Houston and your own congregation, these are all ways to get involved. And one of the things I love about the Texas Freedom Network, in addition to your work on reproductive rights, you're also working on religious freedom and a variety of other things that all intersect. So if it's not on your network for everybody tuning in today, I would say, do your quick Google search now, put your info in, and NCJW Houston, and make sure that you're connected to the organizations locally that are doing this work, because this battle we're fighting about reproductive health rights and justice, it is going to be won at a state level and at a local level. And that's really where you can make the greatest change. So I know there's amazing national organizations, still get involved with them, but particularly in your state, there is so much you can do. There are so many people who need to be influenced. There's so much organizing that needs to happen. And I really want to encourage you to make an impact locally and statewide, to be pushing your legislators and be working on voting issues to make sure everybody is voting and voting people in who care about these issues.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more. Some of the people watching this know, before I went to rabbinical school, I worked for an organization called the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And RCRC was an organization actually born out of something called the Clergy Consultation Network, which was a pre-Roe organization, an interfaith organization of predominantly Jewish and Christian clergy who worked in a time when abortion was in many places in the country illegal, as a sort of underground railroad to get women to abortion services when they needed them. And one of the things I was really proud of was that rabbis and Jews generally were instrumental in the creation of the Clergy Consultation Service, along with Christian partners, and then instrumental in the creation of RCRC, which was the inheritor of that tradition, and had been a part of creating a lot of the reproductive justice movements in the era before and after Roe. And what I heard when I was working in this work in the mid 2000s was there were still a lot of Jews on our board, and we were still around, but there was also this feeling of the Jewish community wasn't showing up on this issue in the way that we had decades earlier. And there was a feeling of sort of taking for granted. And I literally remember a board meeting where another board member said, I just don't understand where the Jews are anymore. And that broke my heart and stuck with me. And I am wondering, Sheila, if you have theories, and Rabbi Silk may have theories also, what does that mean? What does it call us to do? Do you agree that that's what's happening? NCJW baby being the exception to that, but talk a little bit about how you view that.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree, and I think it's changing. I think there's a million reasons. I can't get through them all. I for sure think the National Council of Jewish Women has held this consistently as an issue. We fought for Roe, and we're still fighting. There's a few things. On the one hand, there are a lot of members and people in the Jewish world and the Jewish community at large where we are located in hubs where abortion access is not being threatened. And I think there is a little bit of taking it for granted and not understanding what's happening in our own neighborhoods to different populations, around fake abortion clinics popping up that we have to make sure, how horrible is that? People go, they think they're having an abortion, and they show up and somebody's giving them a pamphlet about how they're sinning and shaming them. Those are things that's happening in Texas. It happens in New York. It happens wherever there are people, these kinds of things happen, and we can work on those things. But I do think they're, disproportionately, these restrictions are geared at women of color and low-income women of color. And I want to name it because it's important. We see the thread of systemic racism to so many issues we have today, but it hasn't been brought up in the same way. You can see the prison pipelines stemming from Jim Crow laws, but also these are disproportionately impacting women of color, low-income women of color in the South. And it's something that we have to pay attention to. Now, of course, 15% of Jews are people of color. And so this impacts our own population and the people that we're around, but it's also disproportionately impacting the vulnerable. And because people don't talk about abortion all the time, because it's still in many ways considered taboo at certain things, and women are often blamed, and pregnant people in general are blamed for their decisions, you don't hear about it in the same way, which makes it more challenging to have this epiphany that everybody here knows somebody who's had an abortion. And let me just say that again. You all know somebody who has had an abortion, and you all love somebody who has had an abortion. And so the side note to what you've asked me, addition to the legislative things you can do, one of the best things you can do to help with abortion access and rights in this country is to talk about abortions with your friends and your families, whether you've had one, no pressure if you've had one to talk about it. Bring it up in conversation, ask people their thoughts. There's so many movies right now tackling this issue. Watch one of them together, make it a part of the conversation, because it's actually really important for people to register in their brain that they love someone who has had an abortion. And this isn't some kind of foreign topic that we're talking about that happens only over there. So those are some of the things. And then I'd say, in general, the religion thing actually really matters. And it's what we are hoping to counter very specifically with Rabbis for Repro. And Josh, I wish you had been my rabbi, but I will just say, in however many years in the Jewish world that I've been a part of, at camp, at youth group, at synagogue, you name it, I've done it. The word abortion has not come up. Reproductive rights had not come up. And a progressive, social justice oriented space. And so I think it's really important. In the same way we see so many rabbis, as soon as they saw Justice Amy Coney Barrett, come into play in the Supreme Court, were talking about how they would talk about marriage equality. I want to see people talk about reproductive justice as well. And I want to see people be outspoken on this topic and to know their position on it. And not just to say, we support your right to have this medical decision in the most dire of circumstances. It shouldn't be qualified in that way. It needs to be that we support and trust you, wonderful people in our community and everywhere else, to do what's right for you. And so as we go on this journey to bring the topic of abortion back into the Jewish community, back into the faith space, et cetera, I think we're actually are on a little bit of an arc that has to happen, with the first step being accepting that abortion is actually okay according to Jewish tradition, but moving to this place, as we've talked about before, of beyond tolerating it, right? And going to love and acceptance. I think this kind of, it's permitted if X, Y, and Z. It's a lovely starting point, and we want to move to a place as communities where we are able to very proudly, loudly say that reproductive health rights and justice, that all of these are Jewish values, and that people having laws around their body and controlling their body is just as bad. When you watch the old-timey shows that are super popular right now, who else is watching Bridgerton, right? Where women get pregnant and then have no options. We should have advanced since then. And it's on us to move it along. So I named in there a few of probably so many reasons. I'm curious from the rabbis who are here, your thoughts on what I missed or what resonated, and why the Jewish community, maybe with the exception of NCJW as an organization, has been pretty silent on this in the last several years as these laws have been coming into place. I'm flipping it back on you.
Yeah, my sense is that it also has to do with access to care, and that I think the Jewish community by and large has really good access to care, and even members of our community who struggle, in any way, through our amazing Jewish Family Service Network and one another, we are often able to get people the help and support that they need quite skillfully. And so I think it flies under the radar, not because Jews aren't needing this kind of medical support and care, but because it is available, and that, that within the community, we're helping to ensure that people have that, right? If somebody comes to their rabbis and says, I'm having a problem, somebody knows somebody, someone says, call Jewish Family Service, we know somebody, right? There's all this connection, and there is this beautiful safety net in our community that I think we are so accustomed to having, and we're dedicated to maintaining, that other communities are not as fortunate to have, and we need to then help create that for other communities. But I think that's part of the reason also we don't hear it, not because it's not happening.
Yep. 100%. It's not that like in the Jewish community specifically, people are still having abortions, right? Like the statistics aren't necessarily the same over faith and over a variety. They're not necessarily different over that. So these are important things for us to acknowledge in our own communities, for sure.
Yeah, and I think there was also a sort of taking for granted. I think in part it's easy to take something for granted when it's easy for you, right? Like I think what we've discovered is what may have always been true, but is certainly true in the last few decades, is that abortion is legal in America for some.
Well, and I'll just take it one step further, Josh, or maybe I should be calling you Rabbi Fixler on this call. Josh and I are very good friends. Know that you can all refer to him as Rabbi Fixler. I think we have to name it as white privilege. I know we're a multiracial faith group, and with them being majority white, I think that's part of this like assumption of access, and this assumption that we'll be able to get what we need, and this assumption that people will be able to have the money to get what they need. It's all a part of the things that people's brain don't have to do all day long, which is, part of the definition of that kind of privilege. So I do want to name it that way. And in our quest, I think for so many people, I'm white. So in my quest to be anti-racist every single day, this is a part of it. And to acknowledge that if I needed an abortion, I could probably get one. And who are the people who can't get them? And where are they? And how can, not in white savior syndrome, but how are we following Black women who are leading the reproductive justice movement? How are we following them, listening to them, and making sure that we are being productive in the way that we're going about this work?
Thank you for being one of the leaders and for knowing what it means to lead in coalition, which means to also sometimes center other voices. There have been really great questions asked in the chat, I think a lot of which we've gotten to. There have been some technical questions about the texts, which are great questions. And I think what they're calling me to do is we will have a conversation as the clergy team about where we can find a venue to engage even more deeply in the sort of text study question in a way that can be dialogue and not just us telling you. There's so much more than Rabbi Silk could get to in that time. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A that we haven't gotten to was asked specifically in the context of the Supreme Court, but Roe v. Wade was a decision decided based on a right to privacy that was inferred out of the Fourth Amendment. And in my analysis as a non-constitutional scholar, some of the challenge that we have faced in the years since Roe, in the 48 years since Roe, has been the sort of some would assess shaky footing of that right to privacy, and to pin this medical decision in right to privacy still leaves it open to quite a bit of sort of judgment and condemnation. And so as we're moving towards wrapping up, I know we were supposed to be an hour, and it's an hour in Jewish time. It's never going to be. It's fine. But what we're saying here tonight is that we understand abortion access also as a First Amendment issue. That we understand it as a separation of church and state issue. And that where we are in a faith tradition that sometimes it's inaccurate to call Judaism pro-choice in so much as there are scenarios where an Orthodox Jewish woman might understand that she's required by her faith to have an abortion if her life is threatened. That's also not a pro-choice position, but it is it's certainly a abortion permissive position. So as you're thinking about what the strategy is for the Supreme Court, and as you're thinking about sort of how we share this message, what are your thoughts about how we reframe this conversation, take it out of the world of the Fourth Amendment and put it into the world of the separation of church and state First Amendment?
Well, first, I would say it is a pro-choice position for somebody, an Orthodox woman, to make a decision that she doesn't want to have an abortion, because it should be the decision of the individual. And exactly, I know what you were referring to there, but important to know that just because somebody believes in the right for people to have access to abortions, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to have them. And you can advocate for people to have that kind of access, even if you yourself feel like you wouldn't want that under any circumstance.
Right. You can advocate for people to be able to access abortion services, even if you would never in your life, you think, access abortion services.
Correct. And it's actually, I hope more people who feel that way actually get involved in this, because this is about giving people all of the options they deserve to have. And, in some cases, it's hard to use the word of choice because it doesn't feel like a choice for certain circumstances. But going through all that language is a story for another day. It is a First Amendment issue. It's not for anyone else to use their faith to tell somebody else what to do from a different faith. And that's what we're seeing happen. We're starting to see legislators talk about their text and their faith tradition as part of why they're supportive of these pieces of legislation that are harmful to particular people's bodies. And what I could say about religious freedom is it's always meant to be a shield to protect. It's never meant to be a sword to discriminate, no matter what we're talking about in all of these things. And so we have to make sure as part of this that anyone, including us, we have lots of feelings about how things should happen, but we would never tell or legislate that for somebody else. And in this case, we're not legislating people to have abortions either. We're legislating, what we want to see is everybody be able to make decisions about their own bodies with their own medical professionals and to decide what's going to be best, safest, healthiest for them and what will make them the happiest. That's all. Just like every other medical decision that everybody gets to make. So I would just say the First Amendment case here is super important and another talking point for people to take up. So as you're, processing what Rabbi Silk shared and all the text there, this is actually excellent material for you to be bringing up with your lawmakers, whether you need to have a Torah study session or what, but to be able to say, like, these are my First Amendment rights. These are the choices I'm making. And when I'm hearing you invoke your faith as part of this, it is feeling restrictive because of X, Y, and Z. It's an important narrative as part of this. And I would just clarify that we are not advocating that anybody here use the Jewish position to legislate for whatever anybody else wants and needs, but we're simply saying we cannot have people legislate to others, to cause harm to others based off what a faith position says. So it absolutely is a First Amendment case. I know Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg and I wrote a piece about the First Amendment case for reproductive rights, probably Googleable if people want to find it, but it was very similar to what Rabbi Silk already shared today. So I'm glad we're all on the same page.
Well, and one of the places that I think this plays out is people try and frame a conversation about when life begins as a starting place for a conversation about abortion access. And they want to use scientific framework for that. They want to point to particular sort of medical development pieces. But what is abundantly clear from the text that Rabbi Silk shared earlier is that the question of when life begins is a religious question, not a scientific question, and that different faiths can have different answers to that. And even Judaism has different answers to that. The pregnancy for the first 40 days is described as being like water. It's described as being a part of the mother's body, like her thigh. Like, we understand that question differently in a fundamental way, and there's room for debate. One of the questions that was in the chat was like, do all rabbis agree with what you're saying? Do all rabbis don't agree on any one thing? So certainly not on this thing. And there is a wide range of approaches to the question of how restrictive or permission to be on the question of abortion. There's a wide range of approaches to the question of like what is life and when it begins, but it's at its core a deeply religious, theological, philosophical conversation. And so our ability to stand up and say that anyone who's looking to use science to create a cover to legislate their theological belief threatens the First Amendment.
And on the other side of the Jewish case for abortion, where I would say most, I would hope, if not all rabbis do agree, is actually about the dignity of people and what it means to be I always say like an alive human being today, or an alive human woman, and what it means to just be able to navigate the world with safety and respect and equity. Our tradition, it's all about that in different ways. Now, there's different ways to interpret it, of course, but as we continue to make a case around a Jewish case for reproductive rights, I would encourage you, there's the whole fetus angle to go at, which, we've got great text around. And then there's also like, what does it mean once you're born? What does it mean that there are 450 laws about my body right now in this country? It's unacceptable. It is unacceptable. And when we see people being outspoken about children in cages, as they should be, when we see people being outspoken about the poor, about, all sorts of things that we talk about all year long through the Torah, through our text, we also have to understand that somebody getting pregnant, it's a major medical experience. It's actually something that leads to death in many cases. It's something to be taken super seriously. It's close to a year of somebody's life just to go through that process. and that person needs to have the ability to make the decisions that are best for them, regardless of the circumstances. And I actually think that dignity case and that we trust you and women are equal kind of case, that needs to be played up a little bit more, because it's not just about the fact that we don't think, a life begins until a baby is born. We also believe that when that baby is born, they are a valuable human being that deserve respect. And so there was a great horrifying, but great cartoon that demonstrated this in like a newspaper at one point. And it showed a woman who was pregnant holding her hands of like a child. And people who are restrictive around abortion were holding the umbrella around the pregnancy bump, right? But not around the human woman and the child. And so I'd just like to say there is so much we need to do around women's rights in this country, trans rights in this country, around protecting children in this country. And when you look at this as an example, this just shows you the way people are valuing that particular group of people. It is totally rooted in the sexist nature of our country. As we talk about systemic racism, we also have systemic sexism. These two are overlaid and playing out in these laws. And honestly, if you are watching Bridgerton or like Pride and Prejudice, whatever it is in these like old timey shows, I want to believe that things are super duper different, that we have more rights today, and we do. It's getting better with every decade and every 100 years. But at the core, you're still seeing these challenges around women getting pregnant and people who can get pregnant getting pregnant and not being able to make the decisions that they need for themselves. And it's about time that we fix that.
I have nothing to add to that. Thank you for that sermon, because it's the Torah we needed to hear, and we are so lucky to have you as a leader, and I am grateful to you for making time to be here. I'm grateful to Reverend Erica Forbes from Texas Freedom Network for being here and sharing your wisdom and being one of the people in the state that we can follow in this work, and Rabbi Silk for sharing your Torah and the Torah around these issues, and Elisa Plotkin. All of you for joining us. I want to give just a couple of things you should know are coming up. On January 28th, NCJW nationally will be offering a webinar entitled The State of Our Union, which will be a conversation between Sheila and legislators around issues pertaining to women, children, and families and priorities for the 117th Congress. And I will put in the chat in just a second a link to where you can sign up for that. The other program that I wanted to tell you about is that Rabbis for Repro, NCJW's program that you've heard a lot about tonight, is sponsoring on Parshat Mishpatim, Shabbat Mishpatim, February 12th and 13th, what they're calling Repro Shabbat, where synagogues all over the country will be having some kind of programming around reproductive justice. I'll put a link to that. You should pressure your clergy to participate if they're not already. Speaking of, on Friday night, February 12th, I'm going to be giving a sermon that night, which will be passages from an article that I've co-authored with Rabbi Emily Langowitz about reproductive justice and Parshat Mishpatim, which will appear in a forthcoming social justice Torah commentary from the Central Conference for American Rabbis. So we hope you will tune into our live stream on that night for a sermon that will continue this conversation. And like I said, for those of you who are asking really good, important questions about sort of the texts that we didn't have time to get into all the intricacies of, we will look for another venue to continue that conversation, because clearly there is a hunger for it, which is amazing. And I will just end by saying, again, with some gratitude with immense gratitude for all the people who helped to make this night happen, and to David Cantor and Jason Plotkin for helping on our sort of tech end. I also want to say that we are a Reform synagogue. The Reform movement is deeply rooted in the fundamental idea that people are ethical decision makers, that God's greatest gift to us, the way in which we are created, B'Tselem Elohim, is our ability to make ethical decisions, and that God trusts us to make those decisions, and that God isn't so hung up on the details of those decisions, because we express our B'Tselem Elohiminess, our like Godedness, when we make those decisions. And so what I heard in what you were saying, Sheila, there at the end, was that as we move beyond this question is about, well, abortion in these cases, I don't know, is that what we're striving for is a world that is affirming of choices in the way that Reform Judaism prides itself and strives to be, affirming of choices and affirming of individuals as ethical actors in this world. How do we create a world that empowers ethical choices, that celebrates those choices, and that creates for all of us the possibility to view those choices as sacred. So I think this conversation is part of that journey. I think that Sheila, your leadership, Reverend Erica, your leadership is part of that journey, and we look forward to continuing to walk that journey with you. So we want to thank everyone who participated this evening. Thank you for being here. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat also if you have follow-up questions. And we look forward to continuing. There's more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.